Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be taking a look at what is probably the best APU that has ever been made. This is the AMD Ryzen 7 5700G, and it just sips power. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at the AMD Ryzen 7 5700G, which is a APU from AMD, which is a Accelerated Processing Unit, or iGPU, whatever you want to call it. It's basically got integrated graphics, and it's actually got pretty decent integrated graphics, although saying decent integrated graphics is a very unusual thing to say because generally they are pretty poor. And if you're on the Intel side of the fence, you'll know this, although you do have the advantages there with QuickSync, which for video editing and for basic workhorse PC use, then it's actually pretty good. But for a little bit of gaming on an extreme budget, the AMD APUs, especially the Vega 7 and Vega 8 models, do particularly well for basically very little money. Now, this processor I actually picked up as a used bargain for somewhere in the region of about £130, which at the time of filming, towards the end of March 2023, is about what you'd expect to see. And considering this is an 8-core 16-thread processor with a TDP of 65 watts, I think this is an absolute bargain, and performance is absolutely excellent in productivity, work apps, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., obviously internet browsing and that sort of stuff. And also, it's actually quite good in gaming, believe it or not. Who'd have thought it? Anyway, so in today's video, we're going to go through, take a look at, I think there's 8 titles that I've gone through playing today, recorded some footage, etc., so you can take a look and see what you can potentially expect. What I've tried to do on this is, generally for a lot of benchmarks, people tend to go with the lowest possible resolution, lowest possible settings, and to get the highest FPS possible. Now, for me personally, I think when people do that, it basically looks trash. And the whole point of playing games, in my mind, is to actually enjoy them and look at some of the graphical fidelity, which isn't always possible. So we're trying to make the game look nice, but also perform pretty well. And basically, we're not using a graphics card, we're using an integrated iGPU. Yeah, this is probably not going to be pretty. But anyway, let's go. Let's take a look into it now. And we'll start off, first of all, with my favourite game of all time at the moment. That is Recfest. So this is Recfest running at 1080p at medium settings. Now you can, if you want to, notch up to high and you still will get playable frame rates. Although I feel medium is a pretty good option on this, and we're still getting anywhere between 60 and 80 frames per second at 1080p full resolution, no scaling whatsoever. The game runs very fast, very smooth, there's no lag, stutter, anything like that. It just runs very well. Now I should mention as well, this is actually running on our X570 platform and with just 16 gigs of RAM. Now obviously, because this is an APU, some of that RAM is actually going to be shared. So we're currently set in the BIOS to share the minimum, which is 512 megabytes or half a gig. With AMD, they do adjust dynamically. So if the graphics or the onboard graphics requires more memory, then it will dynamically allocate it up to some in the region of 2 to 4 gigabytes, depending on your motherboard configuration, etc. But anyway, 16 gigs is all we got in here, and it runs really nicely. Next up is going to be another driving game, so we're looking at Rocket League now. Now Rocket League again is one of those titles, if you put everything on low, you can get some absolutely stellar results. But again, we want to have some kind of visual presence here, and running the game at 1080p, mostly high settings, we are still getting towards that 60 frames per second. My gameplay isn't particularly good on this, and for some reason, I don't know why I was doing particularly badly. We do seem to be hitting the 60 FPS marker. Ideally, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more. Now, of course, you can go through into the menu and turn off certain settings. There are going to be some graphical settings in Rocket League which will make a huge difference. But turning down the actual resolution isn't one of those, so we've left that at 1080p. So that's enough of Rocket League. Let's take a look at another one of those classic esports titles. So this is CSGO, or CS Counter-Strike Geo, whatever you want to call it. This is CSGO. 1080p, high settings, pretty much what the system has selected for itself. And again, it runs very smoothly. The lag is pretty much non-existent, and we're getting somewhere between 80 and 100 frames per second, which for this type of title is absolutely fine. Once again, at the risk of repeating myself, you can turn down some of the graphical settings in here to increase your frames per second. But for 1080p, no scaling whatsoever. I think this runs really well, although my gameplay was absolutely hideous. I blame it on the mouse. Next, something actually very taxing on the system. This is probably one of the ones which actually hurt it the most. So we're looking at Cyberpunk 2077. This is running at 1080p with basically the kind of user applied settings. So basically low everything. And it still actually looks really, really nice in my opinion. My gameplay, as always, is pretty much horrendous. And again, I'm blaming it on the mouse, which I should use a proper mouse, but this is for testing purposes, so it's not about my gameplay, it's about the frames per second. And we are getting a slightly cinematic, somewhere between kind of 25 to 50 frames per second, so most of the time it's around 30, which I feel for this particular title is very playable. And actually it still looks very nice. We look at things like shadows, etc. It's all been rendered very nicely and visually is very appealing, which was the idea of this particular video. Next up, we're looking at Doom, and again, this is Doom at 1080p. This is mostly medium settings. Things like motion blur and stuff that we always turn off anyway, because motion blur is just hideous. And with this, we're getting somewhere between 30 and 60 frames per second. Mostly, I'm glad to say, it's more between the 45 and 60 frames per second. The 30 frames per second lows generally are slightly less, and in some more demanding areas, obviously it is going to drop down if there's lots of artifacts on the screen, lots of explosions, etc. You will expect those dips. But certainly Doom, being one of those fast action FPS shooters, actually runs very nicely and is no issue at all on this great little Ryzen 7 5700G. Moving on to Far Cry New Dawn. This is also running at 1080p. This is on normal settings. Now personally, I would probably suggest maybe knocking it down to low. I wouldn't suggest lowering the resolution scaling or actually changing to 720p or 900p. I find with that you do lose some of that visual clarity. So again, we are looking for actual resolution and clarity here rather than raw FPS. Lots of foliage, lots of grass, lots of things going on. So lots for the GPU to be contending with, but as you can see, it does it very nicely. Next, we're going to look at the new Fortnite. So this is running in DX11, not in DX12, and not in performance mode. So this is probably the best version if you want stability. This runs very nicely again. We're in 1080p. I've set it to auto. So at the beginning when you fire up Fortnite, it says, do you want the system to detect what is best for your system? And I thought, well, let's go with that and see what it actually looks like. And in gameplay, we're getting somewhere between 70 and 90 FPS, which is absolutely fine. Anything below 60, I feel you probably want to knock down a few settings, but we have got the view distance here set to far. Not epic, but far I think is absolutely fine in this. And I actually did very, very well in this game. In fact, I did get to come second. Unfortunately, I failed to press record, so you're just watching me meander around the map and do pretty poorly. I kind of gave up after that. 15 minutes of my life wasted. Anyway, let's not waste any more time and let's take a look at another game. So this is going to be Asphalt 9. Now this is one of those kind of built-in games from the Windows Store which kind of runs on a potato. But just to give you some idea, if maybe you don't want to install all those kind of other games like Recfest, Rocket League, CSGO, etc., you just want to play some of those kind of games that are built into the Microsoft Store, it handles them no problem at all, as you'd expect. Those are generally made for running on things like tablets, so there's going to be no problems at all. But this looks very, very nice, very graphically pleasing. For some reason, MSI Afterburner just fails to detect it as an application, so it didn't pop up. But this feels very slick, and I'd be amazed if it isn't somewhere in the 150 to 200 frames per second. It does run very nicely. I don't think there's actually a cap on this game as such. Maybe there is. Let me know in the comments if you are somewhat of a Asphalt 9 Legends aficionado. So there you go, there you can see some of the gameplay. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons. Now, the pros are the fact that obviously you can run this. It is an extremely low TDP. So we're looking at 65 watt TDP, selectable in the BIOS to 45 watts. So if you want to save a little bit more power, or you've got a particularly small enclosure you're putting your system into, then you can do. This processor is actually going to end up going into my media center PC, which is in the front room, which is currently housing a 2200G, which even still does get rather warm. I guess it was just one of those early edition Ryzens. where it did get quite warm. Although with this is currently running at the moment. We've got the stock stealth cooler on here, and it's basically silent. And even when I was running the benchmarks, 3D Mark, etc., it was, again, absolutely silent, so no problems there at all. If you go for a slightly beefier cooler, you may find you get slightly better results, and obviously if you want to, you can overclock the snot out of these things, including the GPU and also the processor itself. We haven't done this on this particular test. We've literally just put it in and we're running it at stock settings. So again, you can do things like undervolting, which will reduce temperatures even more if you have, like I said, one of those smaller enclosures. But this has run really well. I'm running on a Thermaltake 450 watt power supply, which actually is probably overkill for this. You can get away with running one of these on somewhere in the region of about a 200 watt power supply. So if you're looking at something like the InWin B1 chassis or the Chopin, that sort of thing, it's going to run absolutely fine on one of those 200 watt power supplies, or maybe even a Pico power supply if you want to go down that route. And actually, talking of 3D Mark, we actually did the test on there. I wasn't expecting anything, but it actually come up with a legendary result. So pretty happy with that. It's very rare I see that because we generally do slightly lower end equipment here on the channel, as you're fully aware. But to get a legendary result, I thought was fantastic. So I wanted to put that on the screen for you to see. But again, this is a great CPU, and something else as well, it does actually sit power. Because this is the slightly older generation of Zen processors, this is the more traditional monolithic die rather than chiplet design, and because of that, it can actually sip power. This does come very close to Intel processors in terms of how low it can go. I did actually register somewhere in the region of about 5 to 6 watts at idle conditions, or basically just with a web browser open, which is excellent. So low power usage, again, keeping the temperatures down. And even after we did the testing, the highest recorded wattage through all the testing we've done was about 88 watts, which again, is basically nothing. If you think most graphics cards will kind of almost idle at that at some instances. So yeah, extremely low power usage, which is another pro for this, obviously with energy prices being what they are as we stand currently at 2023. So all good things must come to an end, like this video, but also there are things which this particular setup, there are going to be drawbacks. Now, one of which, probably the biggest one for some people, is going to be the fact that you're limited to PCI Express Gen 3 speeds. So that is going to be if you install a graphics card in your spare slot, that is going to run at PCI Express Gen 3 speeds. Now, for a lot of graphics cards, things like GTX 1070s, which would pair absolutely fantastic with this, it's going to be no problem at all, and you're not going to notice any real problems. But if you maybe decided to pair something like the RX 6500 XT, any of the 6000 series from AMD, and some of the newer 3000 and 4000 series from NVIDIA, which I guess is kind of unlikely with this processor, but you never know. Some people may do it. You can potentially see a bottleneck in the system. You're not going to get your full PCI Express Gen 4 speeds. Now, for some of the graphics cards, like the aforementioned RX 6500 XT, that really does need that ×4 bandwidth to get the performance out of it which it needs because of the limited bus. There is going to be a problem. So if you are considering that, don't get something else together. Like I said, 1060, 1070 is going to be absolutely fine and going to run really well with this, as will some of the 20 series RTX cards. Another potential issue, again, because we've not got PCI Express Gen 4 lanes, if you're using an NVMe drive, in this particular instance, I've put in my Kingston NV2, which is a PCI Express Gen 4 ×4 drive. And as you can see in the user benchmark PC results here, the rest of the system is actually performing great, or as expected, or better than expected. But we did suffer with our data transfer speeds because we are going to be limited to basically half the bandwidth that this drive can potentially do. So obviously do bear that in mind as well. There's absolutely no point spending a ton of money on a PCI Express Gen 4 ×4 storage media if you're keeping with this processor. If it's just a stopgap and you're maybe going to upgrade to a different 5000 series processor at a later date, or even go back to something like a 3900X, then it's going to be fine. But obviously do bear that in mind. If this is going to be your processor for the long term, just avoid any PCI Express Gen 4 devices. So there you go, there are the pros, there are the cons, and you can see the gameplay. I think this is a great little system. With those 8 cores and 16 threads, it powers through most tasks. Again, you'll probably see in the Cinebench result here, which we scored somewhere in the region of about 14,000 points, which again, is a fantastic score. If you consider processors such as the Ryzen 5 3600, you're lucky if you get between 8 to 9,000 on those. So it's actually a big step up in performance, and the price is really good. And even on Amazon at the moment, you can pick them up brand spanking new with the box cooler, which is the Wraith Stealth, for somewhere in the region of about £160. If you want to go for the used market, I would suggest shopping around. For those in the UK, If you go over to somewhere like CEX, I would strongly advise against it currently. Their prices for used chips are basically the same as new. There's only about £5 to £10 difference. So I would give them a miss at the moment. But if you can find a bargain on Facebook, or perhaps if you head over to our Discord and you can look in where people are selling their own components, you may pick up a bargain, as I did. So thank you very much, Dom, for this one. Do appreciate it. And as soon as I've finished recording this video and press stop, I'll be sending over the PayPal money. Anyway, I think that's going to pretty much wrap this video up. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have, smash the like button. If you want to see more content like this on a daily basis, then hit subscribe and the chime notification and you'll be notified of future video releases. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.